Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the final day. I will just give one lecture today, and that is Apocalyptic Futures, Future Possibilities, Survey of Cli-Fi, or Climate Fiction and Science. I add science because, as I've been saying, I'm not an expert on climate fiction, but I'm interested in it, and I've read about it. But I added the science because that's an inextricable part of this field. Um, by the way, just into this morning's Times of India, there's a interview with an American philosopher of environment, Laurie Gruen, on ecofeminism. Very timely. So um, I thought that was interesting. So I tore it out of the paper. I hope that was okay. Um, coined less than 20 years ago, climate fiction characterizes most dystopian, post apocalyptic speculative fiction that imagines the effects of climate change on people and environments. J.G. Ballard's 1962 novel, The Drowned World, is credited with being the first such work of fiction. And of course, as we know since then, innumerable short stories and novels have appeared, as well as some films. Um, Notable names include Margaret Atwood, Octavia Butler, Richard Powers, and Kim Stanley Robinson, but there are many, many others who are selling very well around the world. And the one I mentioned was we were just talking about Kim Stanley Robinson's 2020 novel, The Ministry for the Future, which offers what is said to be a credible portrayal of our future, though I have not read it. But he does do research for these. So the classic 1936 satirical science fiction novel, War with the Newts, as translated into English from Czech by the Czech writer Karel Čapek. It looks like a C with an accent above it. Čapek or Čapek, who coined the word robot, as you may know, in his 1920 novel R.U.R. The War with the Newts is about humans discovering an Indian Ocean sea-dwelling race of intelligent newts, which are amphibious salamanders, lizard-like creatures, and then capturing and exploiting them. Now, he was partly being satirical. Also, he was writing in 1936 in the Soviet kind of context, because the Czech Republic was, as you know, like a lot of the Eastern European countries, was taken over. But the newts gain human knowledge and rebel against their human captors, initiating a world war. Čapek or Čapek clearly satirizes all social and political movements for dominance. He also had in mind not just the rise of the Soviet Union, but at that time, 1936, was when Hitler was just coming into power and so forth. But the novel also influenced writers who documented how we humans have destroyed so many other creatures, which, as we know, animal studies has looked at. Although not, then I mentioned the other one that came out in 1963, Planet of the Apes, right? So we've seen that. So these are just two kind of examples that deal very different. And certainly Planet of the Apes is not a literary of value, considered of literary value, but it is part of the times in which these novels were occurring. So together with Ballard's novel, The Drowned World, which is of a very real world, London, and does not have sort of futuristic creatures or something necessarily. One example of scholarship on these books is Cheryl Hamilton's 2016 essay which discusses the story's premise on which personhood of non-human animals depends. That is, um, looking at the Planet of the Apes in particular. So I was looking for criticism on that, and there is some, but um, cultural theorists and popular culture critics like to talk about it. So it's interesting. And she argues that um, those advocating that humans should accord such personhood to any other creature assume that this involves, quote, the erasure of animalism, unquote, and therefore a violent disciplining of non-human animals to make it civilized. So in other words, she's a legal scholar, I should add, Canadian legal scholar. So it's interesting to see these uh, thinkers, intellectuals coming from different disciplines, looking at Planet of the Apes as a kind of case study for how do we accord, what are the ethics and what is the logic on which we base the sense of personhood for anything that is non-human. So this becomes a legal matter as well, right? And in fact, a lot of science fiction and scientists have been asking, demanding, and we need a kind of ethical code of rights for, or a code of ethics, if you will, for artificial intelligence, for robots, which is part of that. Because if we wait, it may be too late, right? So Robinson's Ministry for the Future, and I'm based on what I've read about it from a review in Publishers Weekly, is set in the near future and concerns a governmental ministry that advocates for the health and safety of all future generations, so unborn generations, on the principle that future rights of the unborn are valuable. And we know that some young people groups, not just Greta Thunberg, but in other areas of the world, have been advocating, saying to the adult world, they are putting forth lawsuits to try to have some guarantees about their future. And they say one of the things you have to do is address climate change. So that's interesting, right? So you get all these, it's not just literature and it's not just science, it's people from ordinary people, and young people are really taking the lead here. The 2003 novel by Margaret Atwood is part of her dystopian trilogy, Oryx and Crake. So this is the first novel in a trilogy. Describes, quote, a world where social inequality, genetic technology, and catastrophic climate change has culminated in some apocalyptic event. And of course, she's the author of The Handmaid's Tale, and has written, she does tend to write kind of speculative fiction, but not entirely, but mostly. In our everyday world, we of course have talked about Greta Thunberg, and I found she began, by the way, protesting at the age of 14 in front of the Swedish Parliament. That's amazing. But I found some interesting interviews, if you're interested, and I'll put this email website link in the notes, which is part of UNICEF's, this one was UNICEF's 2021 webpage titled Young Climate Activists Demand Action and Inspire Hope. But there are many such websites. We could also, of course, as you know, look back. One way to look at climate change is to look retrospectively, to look at past novels and poems, to see what, perhaps some are canonical ones, to see if they are commenting on the climate in any way, and paintings. So we know that we've had paintings of The Year Without the Summer and so forth. And you know about Byron's poem Darkness, which is after which was prompted by that experience of The Year Without the Summer. There was also a particularly harsh time in the 1500s, but that's different. When a sulfuric pall hung over Europe as a result of Indonesia's Mount Tambora eruption, which caused temperatures to plunge. Although a natural event, so this is not a human cause, right? The poem showed later writers that they could depict the natural world's destructive power. It can be interpreted metaphorically, of course, his poem. But it's clearly he describes that atmospheric change. In fact, one argument is that that's why, I remember now, I didn't put it in the notes, but, a year later when, about this time actually, The Year Without the Summer, when Mary Shelley and Percy Shelley and Byron and all their friends were holed up in an Italian house, and then she came up with the idea for Frankenstein, which is not about the climate, but it occurred at this time. So I mean, we can relate maybe to the pandemic, right? Everyone is closed in more than usual. Anthropogenic or human-caused climate change was recognized only later, though its effects are unwittingly recorded in literature, such as the London fog in Doyle's Sherlock Holmes stories. And in fact, this was not fog. In fact, there was a chain of clothing called London Fog. And this also gave rise to the inspired film noir when film came along with the gas lighting, which also becomes another term. But the actual gas lamps became a favorite in the 30s and 40s, even into the 50s, with as a kind of, because it had this halo effect. But that was not fog, that was smog. So it was a mix of natural humidity and so forth, precipitation, with the coal fire, the coal-generated pollution. So I remember taking a walking tour in London, and the guide said that he was an older guide, and he said he remembered that it was only, as a child he grew up with that, but it was only in the 1960s that dissipated due to efforts to stop coal burning. As we know, the planet's temperature has risen a full 1 degree Celsius average for the whole planet since the Industrial Revolution began, and as we know, the past decade has been the warmest on record. So I mentioned Amitav Ghosh's The Great Derangement. So he did talk about this, just to reiterate what I said one day, that he did talk about the challenge of imagining this kind of slow violence because we can't see it, but we see the effects. And we were talking just before this started of floods and landslides, but also the crazy weather everywhere and the resulting destruction combined with human folly. His book has 3 parts: stories, history, and politics. 1, 2, 3. So that tells you that, when you look at science fiction, this genre seems to demand a little more in terms of science and a little more in terms of current events and geopolitics, relatively speaking. Ghosh argues that because of the scale of climate change, its manifestations are uncanny. That is, a feeling that is both familiar and strange. As we've said, though, he does not discuss climate fiction, per se. But that idea of the uncanny is certainly there because we're used to all kinds of, natural catastrophes. But it's hard to think of the whole planet, right? It's just such a vast idea. And for example, radioactive waste can, go over to the other side of the world. We know that, for example, the sand from the Sahara Desert blows over into Europe, right? That's always been the case. But if you add to that pollution, right? And so now when they take core samples from like Greenland, from the Arctic, ice samples, they find an alarming rise in pollutants. Pertinent to our course, Ghosh has given us a concise overview of the role of colonialism as well in producing our climate crisis. So that's something that a lot of climate fiction does not deal with. And so I think that's an important thing that post-colonial studies can bring. As he shows, and other scholars have, many of the world's great cities have overridden the experiences and lessons of earlier indigenous inhabitants. And so the modern cities just erase all those ideas to the point where New York City, I mean, many cities are built on, were originally built near rivers, right? But some of those rivers have disappeared but they're underground, whether it's New York City or London, right? And so that's interesting. He blames both imperialism and late capitalism for this. I'm talking about Ghosh, and warns that unless we do more, our future is in peril. In a favorable review of the book, Raghu Karnad writes that Ghosh follows a mystical tug from nature, which he capitalizes nature, this reviewer, a slight flirtation with Gaia, commenting on uncanny synchronicities in our awakening to climate change. He writes, what it suggests, indeed proves, is that non-human forces have the ability to intervene directly in human thought. And it's not like some supernatural way. It just means it can become part of our psyche, right? The point is not to take all of this literally on a one individual level, but to say as a collective sort of experience. It's also to grasp the error so well described in War with the Newts of treating the environment as an inert resource. This is what Karnad is in his review is saying. So the problem of treating the environment as a non-dynamic, as kind of static, or of denying that purpose or prerogative, that any purpose or prerogative can exist in any part of nature except ourselves. So agency is indifferent. It's hard to grasp. Dipesh Chakrabarty's important 2009 essay, The Climate of History, 4 Theses, has spawned much productive theoretical considerations, including a special issue of a journal a few years later. The essay reviews the Earth's environmental history that has led to the present Anthropocene, which, as I've noted, means that humans are now causing this, and which, I think I'll mention this in a minute, has not been accepted by everyone. Chakrabarty's argument proceeds logically according to these 4 theses or arguments. One is these are not his, this is paraphrased. The distinction between natural and human history is no longer tenable. Now, he's a historian, so he says natural and human history can't separate. Now, in a way, that's a lot of historians, there's a huge boom in climate history. So how past events have been shaped by climate or also by disease, but sometimes it's the climate that causes the disease, right? And of course, indigenous peoples have known this. Thesis 2 argues that because humans are part of nature, the Anthropocene also affects human cultures and identities, including the very meaning of human and humanity, and including modernity. Thesis 3, as a result, histories of global capital formation and effects must be involved in any discussions of the natural environment. This is not to be anthropocentric, just to be realistic, he says. Finally, thesis 4, we must therefore learn to combine the history of species with human histories, especially imperialism and capitalism, and can no longer talk about history as distinct from vice versa, or as distinct from nature or vice versa. So, as we can see, both Chakrabarty and Ghosh call for a new way of perceiving and conceiving of the Earth's present and possible futures, and all of these activists, thinkers, writers want to jog us out of our complacency. Now there has been quite a lot of creative and scholarly writing, but it's not the only means of expressing climate change. Of course, there are paintings and photographs. We've looked at Chris Jordan's, um, but some have recorded atmospheric changes. The National Gallery of Art in the U.S. has a great website with some of these famous works under. I don't. I didn't put the title here. I forget, but it's something to do. Oh, 5 artworks about climate change, which are famous works. Some are more recent, but a couple are classic. Notable on the site, and this is I mentioned when I was talking about Chris Jordan that there are a lot of great photographers now. One is Edward Burtynsky's series of photos on the construction of the controversial Three Rivers Dam in China about 20 years ago. And those are also at the National Gallery of Art. I'm going to read a couple more things from my notes on the laptop, and then I want to come and look at a couple of those two very, very short stories I had put for reading, which are just exemplify the many, many writers who are trying to poetically make sense of climate change, which includes rising seas. That's a huge part of it. It affects everyone in the world. It affects Indian coastlines, U.S. So, but let me read these points. We're all familiar with global headlines and news stories like this. These are just common examples. Parts of Canada's boreal forest are burning faster than they can regrow. New York Times, August 2024. Or again in the New York Times a year previously, in Texas, dead fish and red-faced desperation are signs of things to come. We also have many, many newspapers now, the top newspapers like, I'm thinking of the New York Times, The Guardian, but there are many that have special sections on the environment, the BBC Online, and sometimes you can actually subscribe to this using your email and get those specific feeds if you're interested. And that's where, for example, I found on the BBC's website the article on Chris Jordan that came out 2 years ago. So also suggestive, by the way, of the fact that his 2009 photos are still having an afterlife. The science journalist Elizabeth Colbert, I think she pronounces it, is The Sixth Extinction, as I've mentioned. That's a collection of her essays, but she's got several books. Is an example of also this creative journalism that is wonderfully written and often assigned in literature courses of eco-criticism courses, but also in science writing and journalism classes. But they're just fun to read. They're written for publications like sometimes the New York Times, sometimes the New Yorker, or whatever. She points out, for instance, and this is interesting this caught my interest, so it's just, we all have different interests, that when the father-son scientist team of the Alvarez duo in 1980 discovered that a large asteroid had hit the Gulf of Mexico 66 million years ago, causing the last massive extinction, which killed the dinosaurs, but it killed 3/4 of all plants and animals on the planet. So you think, well, okay, so what's that? Well, apparently that was the first time that scientists really became aware that climate change is not gradual. Extinctions are not gradual. They can be caused, that can happen quickly. Now, that was a natural event, right? But it showed that you can have these cataclysmic events that cause massive disruptions. So the other thing, when we come, so she is, of course, writing about the Anthropocene. And so the scientists tell her that she interviews, of course, many, and they tell her that the difference between the human-caused one now and something like that is it causes just the same disruption and massive extinction, but it's not a one-off event. It continues. And it becomes harder and harder the further along. There's a snowball effect, a tipping point. So, and it is still sadly some accelerating despite the efforts of some entities. So I think that was interesting to say that, until then there was this gradualist, theory of gradualism, like over time geology, just takes millions of years, but no. And since then, a lot of other studies south of, so let me back up. I'll give you an example of a natural event that occurred in the area where I live. You may have heard of Salt Lake City, which had hosted the Olympics, is going to host it again in a few years. The Great Salt Lake is drying up. And I have students and friends who live in that area north of Salt Lake City, where some days they have to shut all their windows, everything, and it's toxic stuff blowing over them because there's no water. Now, that lake was produced 14,500 years ago, not that long ago, by the Great Bonneville Flood. You don't have to remember this, but it's just an example. When there were humans in North America. So it's interesting, right, to see how ancient humans, too, prehistoric humans, might have recorded this. And that flood, actually, you can see south of where I live, an hour's drive, there's a sort of a huge sort of natural sort of cliff area, and I can't think of my words today, but rock formation, and it bursts through that, and it's perfect, like a V shape, and that's 14,500 years ago, and that flooded the whole area. Now, and of course, when you dig around your yard, if you dig like this far below the surface, anywhere where I live, you get big rocks. That's from that flood. But we know that like in the Sahara, when it was 5,000 years ago only, was green. And we have pictographs, pictoglyphs that show people swimming and, things that are fish, all these things, in areas that are totally desert now. So we know that we always kind of knew that these changes could happen quickly, but now that's the other part that's hard to grasp, is how can it happen in one lifetime, right? In our lifetime. And on top of that, how can we grasp the vast implications of it? Last year, there are many such examples. There's Orion magazine, for example, is a creative kind of mix of scholarly and creative works. It publishes a mix of scholarly and creative works on the environment. And for one of its issues was The Age of Floods. And actually the editor is an Indian American, Sumant Prabhakar. And he says, I like how he starts the editorial to this special issue. Like Juan Ponce de Leon, 500 years before, we arrived on the coast of Florida, weary with thirst and age. Once named by its European captor for the lush foliage rising from its wet soil, the state now offered us heaps of gray sand, 800,000 cubic yards dredged from the ebb tidal shoal and piled along St. Augustine beach. Designed to put back what the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers refers to as lost sand in areas where the encroaching tides wear at the shoreline, these ashy mail-order dunes, so they're bringing in the sand, serve as a stopgap flood mitigation, a desperate scheme to avoid the discomforts of retreating from the floods And we walked gingerly up and down them that weekend on our way to visit the Fountain of Youth. So, having fun with this idea, there was that explorer Ponce de Leon, who Spanish conquistador, who said was convinced he could find the Fountain of Youth in Florida. But this editor is also a journalist and visited this area, and so is introducing the this special issue on floods. And what's interesting is, for example, one of the articles in there, which I won't read from, is there are all kinds of articles, and mostly they're about North American. It's a North American magazine, so. One is on the city of Houston, for example, which I was astonished to read because they discovered oil in that area. And only because they discovered oil did they start to grow a city in the late 1800s. But they built on land that kept being flooded. And the foolish human persistence, sometimes we say persistence is good, but not always. Their thick-headedness, they kept building and building, then the floods would come. In fact, just a few years ago, there was a massive flood. And what also, as always happens, the richer people go to outlying areas, sometimes a little higher elevation. The poor have to suffer, but they're not the ones creating, this flood. And that also, you can make these interesting links. This is what I do when I teach anyway, is, okay, so that's one aspect of this. We're building on areas we shouldn't be because we are so thirsty for that oil or whatever it is. What's paradoxical is before the invention of the internal combustion engine, petroleum was used starting in the 1860s. What would it be used for? It was not for, the engines had not been invented yet. Automobiles were not around. It was for oil, for burning lamps and stoves. And that actually, ironically, saved a number of whale populations, because whale blubber, oil and blubber was used for oil in the West for, a couple centuries. So then you think, at the time, if you were a conservator, you would probably say, that's great, we're going to save the whales. But then worse was to come, right, with the invention of the internal combustion engine. So, one thing to keep in mind before I get to these short stories, another couple of things to keep in mind are the interconnections between Anthropocene, what some call Capitalocene, and some even call ecocide, taking the word from like suicide. So I borrow these from a colleague of mine who found these quotes. So I just asked if I could use them. So the Anthropocene, some quotes. Paul Crutzen, who is credited with coming up with the term in 2000, he says, considering the major and still growing impacts of human activities on Earth and atmosphere, and at all, including global scales, it seems to us more than appropriate to emphasize the central role of mankind in geology and ecology by proposing to use the term the Anthropocene for the current geological epoch. It's interesting to see that that's not very old, 25 years. This is a scientist, right? He co-authored another essay in the same year in which he and his co-authors say, developing a worldwide accepted strategy leading to sustainability of ecosystems against human-induced stresses will be one of the great future tasks of humankind. Now, we've had some arguments about when it started. I've already said that there seems to be a consensus, but by no means universal, that some date it from the start of the Industrial Revolution in the late 1700s, such as, for example, James Watt's design for the steam engine in 1784. which is not to say that humans have not, they of course have been affecting the climate before that, but this is the time when it really accelerates, right? Um, Another thing I could say is um, this is from an article called Nuclear Waste in the Anthropocene. The time of the world's first nuclear bomb explosion in 1945 in New Mexico uh, is sometimes argued to be a starting point of the Anthropocene. So that late. And the subsequent bombs detonated at an average of rate of one every 9.6 days until 1988. Between 1945 and 1988 alone, an average rate of almost 10 bombs a day somewhere in the world. Some have uranium, this is what we call uranium depletion, which means uranium is also affecting the soils. In Vietnam, war is a big cause of climate change, of course, and both radioactive and others. And it's really tragic. In fact, my colleague was presenting on, he gave this as part of the context for a presentation on Viet Nguyen's, the Vietnamese American writer and professor, Viet Nguyen's novel, the Insider. What's it called? No, it's not The Insider. Anyway, I'll think of it. And Nguyen, he's dealing with, he himself came from that, his parents came from this background. And Nguyen, who won the Pulitzer Prize and so forth, is talking about a lot of themes in that novel, right? But he does deal with, as my colleague found out, was talking about, the effects of war on the countryside. So if you think of the bombing of, it's really tragic, because I've been to Vietnam as a tourist and go to the State Museum, and it's hard to look at the photos of the effects of Agent Orange on birth defects. Also, it has contaminated in Cambodia and Vietnam, it has contaminated the soil for centuries. Now, that's not the only place, though. There's also weapons testing, weapon war games, right? And so I just thought I'd mention that as one of the important and sad side effects of what we are talking about. One writer wrote in the well-known journal Science in 2015, does it really make sense to define the start of a human-dominated era millennia after most forests in arable regions had been cut for agriculture? So this opposing view is that, well, many places we think of as natural forests, we're not. If you go to the Mayan ruins in the Yucatan in Mexico, it's all dense forest, right? And that looks natural to us. Same with parts of the Amazon. Not all of it, but parts of it. But they're finding that there were these sophisticated civilizations, and the forests were not always there. They've come back, right? So that's a sign of how, yes, nature can rejuvenate, but it's also that humans have been shaping this. As I said last year, March, actually exactly a year ago, let's see if I get this right, the International Commission on Stratigraphy, but the Subcommission of Quaternary Stratigraphy voted, which is a international group of scientists, voted to demote Anthropocene from epoch to event. The capital scene is the historical era shaped by the relations, of course, privileging the endless accumulation of capital. The Anthropocene is a return to a curiously some people say it's a return to a Eurocentric idea of humanity and its reliance on well-worn notions of resource and technological determinism. And I think someone mentioned here, perhaps, or to me anyway, that it's absolutely right that sometimes if we want to talk about the other challenges, like Ghosh says, we have to talk about the planetary results. What about how do we then talk about the local and the planetary at the same time? It's very challenging, right? This interesting book called, um, I've only glanced at a little bit of it, and I put it on the reading list. Jason Moore's Capitalism in the Web of Life, Ecology and the Accumulation of Capital has been somewhat influential too. I could give you a lot more statistics on Vietnam, which is very grim. Um, it used I'll just give you a couple. Between 1964 and 1975, over 7.5 million tons of bombs were dropped on North and South Vietnam. By comparison, just relatively, not just, but 2.1 million tons were used during all of World War II and the Korean War combined. So, right, I mean, it's insane, and this was a tiny area of relatively of the world. And then we have, of course, this appears in a lot of novels, again, the threat of nuclear war. During the Cold War, it was always Russia, America, right? Soviet Union. But now there are other nuclear powers, as we know. And what about nuclear weapons getting in the hands of, a particular group? So these are the parameters of this. Let me go now, skip down. On the recent flooding, the other paradox is that the recent California wildfire, which can lead to flooding because, you take away when you have deforestation, either through logging or through wildfire, you have floods. So I was driving through northern Arizona, hilly area actually, Flagstaff, and 8,000 feet, which is about 7,300 meters or something. No. 2,200 meters. And the traffic was diverted, and I could see all this mud right in the middle of this big road. And because they've been deforesting around there, what do they expect, right? When it rains. So it was interesting to see this in reality. There's also ecocide, where we are poisoning ourselves. Here's a headline: "We are poisoning ourselves." This quote, and then it says, "Ghana gold rush sparks environmental disaster." BBC, October 2024. Water from a polluted river in Ghana was so thick and discolored that an artist, I mentioned this yesterday, was able to use it to paint as paint. He just used it as paint to depict the environmental devastation caused by illegal gold mining, because they have to use mercury to quickly extract the gold. It's a shortcut method. And used by miners to dig on a massive scale in farms and forests, degrading the land while also generating wealth for a relatively small number of people. Right. And then there is an image here on the BBC of this guy painting right there. So those are some of the things context for what we're talking about that Cli-Fi can explore in many different ways, right? So let me just read these couple of stories, see what you think. One is, the second one is flash fiction. Do you know flash fiction? Just very short. Right? But even the first one is very, very short. And this is from a link I provided, which has 7 short stories about climate change. That's what it's called. These are small literary magazines. This is called Parentheses Magazine Online. Waters Are Rising by Anita Govias. First is the beluga whale, a visitor from Greenland. It splashes in the Thames estuary, feeds on bream and gudgeon, type of fish, and scraps thrown from barges. People read about it on websites, flood in to take pictures and videos, and talk about beautiful sea creatures, the power of nature, and how lucky they are to see this in their lifetime. The whale sings into uncomprehending microphones and ears about lost families, lost feeding grounds, and how the waters are rising. So imagining what the whale is singing, right? A silvery harbor seal is next, a pearly flesh of sinew and muscle threading its way underneath piers and fishing nets. The Southend Herald newspaper runs a sweet story about it, following someone down from the Moray Firth. People stop taking pictures after rumors start of a shadow stepping out of piled up pale gray fur at night. Something swirls in the undercurrents, clogging drains. A figure haunts the moonlit streets and dreams of Leigh-on-Sea area in England, shrieking about lost farms, lost crops, and how the waters are rising. The many-headed Naga rolls on a tide in on a tide that brings news of a flood in Bangladesh, a hurricane in Florida, a landslide in Bolivia. People flee in waves from Benfleet, Tilbury, Gravesend, as it destroys boats with a flick of its tail and the coldness of its eyes. Objects float past, handbags, smartphones, cameras. It curls up against Tower Bridge, a bulky mass against an enormous sky. The weight of its belly pushes the water to lap against the road over abandoned cars and bicycles. It basks in the sun it couldn't feel in its deep cave, where it dwelt before the waters caused it to rise. So poetic vision mixed with some actual creatures that we know that sometimes this happens, right? A whale comes into a channel, gets lost, things like that. So, Oceans Under Threat Like Never Before. This is the flash fiction. It's very short, by Melissa Yanez Brownlee. This is in an online journal apparently called Cheap Pop Lit. Kind of trying to make, they're ironic. This is a 2022 story. Tita reads the headline. So again, this is called Oceans Under Threat Like Never Before, and this is the headline. Tita reads the headline from today's paper. We wonder about what that means for us. It's hard enough just surviving here. Our parents working all the time. Our parents living in a house they built, subsidized by Hawaiian homelands. The land ours for only 99 years. So this is from a Hawaiian perspective. Indigenous Hawaii. Nothing ours, not really. Tita thinks it will mean all those golf courses will have to go, and probably all the hotels too. There would still be beaches, they just wouldn't have any sand. Not that the sand matters to us. Most beaches on our island are lava rock anyway. We imagine swimming down Ali'i Drive, jumping off the great banyan trees into the waves. Maybe the whales won't come, or they will come earlier or later, who knows? Maybe Daddy and the uncles won't be able to go fishing anymore, with no harbors to keep their boats. We imagine fishing from the top of Mokuaikua Church, the steeple, the tallest point in town, casting our bamboo poles into the new coral reef growing on its rock-sided walls. We imagine, again, this is imagining, tide pools forming in parking lots of abandoned hotels, wana finding purchase in the cracked asphalt, type of fish, their black spines undulating in their new homes. I think it might be a sea anemone. Sea cucumbers nestled along the yellow lines of the parking stalls, their colors camouflaged. We imagine our house on the mountain, finally a beach house. The ocean waves rolling in to welcome us home. So, some of the images here, these are both on rising seas, right? And the way it disorients humans, but also it disorients the creatures in the seas. And these are by, relatively young authors who are writing out of partly their own experiences and trying to reach a broader audience, right? So this is climate fiction as well. It doesn't have to be novels, obviously, and some of you know more titles than I do in this area. And so I want to just end by looking back at the title. Then is to recap the title of both this lecture and this today's overriding title, which I gave a very broad title to, which is Climate Futures Course Conclusions. But my title for this lecture is Apocalyptic Futures, Future Possibilities, because I don't want us, if we sometimes, the argument is that if everything is presented as apocalyptic and kind of a dead end, there is a danger that some people will feel resigned, right? And helpless, so resigned and helpless that they won't feel we can do anything. But that's not true. What that sudden change in environment, those examples of sudden changes in environment teach us is that we can change. If humans are able to change it to bad ends, perhaps then we are able to change it for the better. And certainly we see the collection, they're trying to collect the plastic that Chris Jordan talked about, trying to find ways to corral that. And so I think that when we say apocalyptic or dystopian or post-apocalyptic, it tends to have a dark connotation, right? I'm thinking of also, the one I had read years ago was The Road by Cormac McCarthy. And there are a lot of science fiction movies like this, right? Which are great to read and think about, but it can become all rather depressing. And so hope is something that some climate fiction writers want to instill. And perhaps the very fact that we are writing such fiction is a sign of hope, right? And that it's popular. And I think I will stop there. Make sure I haven't missed anything. And let me just check my notes online again. If you're interested, as I've said a couple times, in some of these links, again, based on my limited knowledge, but some of the magazines that I've used, like Orion, there's also Nautilus, which are interdisciplinary and are really interesting. There are more and more of these kinds of venues. Needless to say, there are many anthologies and introductions to this that are out there now. So, returning then to the beginning of the week, is this toxic discourse? Yes. It actually encompasses a lot of different features of eco-criticism. So hopefully those tools, and especially as Ghosh pointed out, the connection of most of these, let me back up, most of these repercussions are caused by the unequal distribution of wealth and the poor suffering. That's the environmental justice side of this, bearing the brunt of this. And so you can come at this from many different angles. So thank you very much. And I will be coming back this afternoon for the valedictory, so I won't be saying goodbye. But I think you'll be continuing now after the break. And I'm happy to answer any questions or thoughts. Thanks, everyone. Thank you. Thank you.